Hey everyone, it's Kenji, and we're gonna cook this big Wagyu steak. So this steak is actually not from Japan. It's a Wagyu from, Wagyu is the breed, and it's a Wagyu steak from Pacific Rogue in Oregon. I got this from my friend Kevin Smith, who runs a butcher shop here in Seattle called Beast and Cleaver that does some really great local meats from the Pacific Northwest. So this is a American Wagyu. This is by far the most marbled American Wagyu I've ever seen. Look at the amount of sort of intramuscular fat in there. So that's all the little white lines that run through the meat, and that kind of gonna melt into the meat as it cooks, render into the meat as it cooks, and keep it nice and juicy and give it lots of flavor. And sort of that's what's prized about Wagyu beef when you hear about it. This one is a rib steak. So this is the rib bone from the cow, the steer, I guess. So you can see the spinal column would run along that way. This is what's called the longissimus dorsi, it's the loin muscle that runs all the way along the back of the animal. And then here is called the spinalis, which is this sort of flap that covers the longissimus. So in a rib steak, sometimes this eye of meat's going to be really big, and often that's going to be sort of like the more prized cut of meat where that longissimus is really big. I tend to prefer actually this cut right here. This it's called the spinalis. Sometimes people might call it the decal. Anyhow, I prefer that cut, so I look for rib steaks that have a bigger portion of that cut. I find it to be a little bit more tender, a little more flavorful. All right, so we're gonna cook this thing. Cooking a big fat steak like this, especially one that's so marbled, a little bit different from cooking a thinner steak, but the beginning of the process is the same. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do what's called dry brining, also known as light curing, or you might just call it salting and sitting. So what we're going to do is take that steak, season it really nicely on all sides with just some salt. This is Diamond Crystal kosher salt. You can use Morton's kosher salt. You can use any kind of coarse salt that you want. I like to use coarse salt because it's much easier to pick up with your fingers and sort of get a feel for how it's sprinkling, as opposed to sort of, table salt, which is has grains that are square and kind of slide past each other a little more easily. So it's harder to sort of feel how much you're putting them on or sprinkle them evenly. But you see, I seasoned it on all sides pretty well. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it on a rack, on a tray, so that it stays elevated like that, so that air circulation can get around it. And then I'm going to put it in the fridge. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave it there for a couple days. And what's going to happen is that the salt initially is going to sort of dissolve. It's going to pull out some liquid from the meat, but it's eventually going to dissolve in that juice from the steak that it pulls out, that water that it pulls out, and create a sort of hyper concentrated brine that is then going to start working its way slowly into the meat. And what happens is that some of the muscle proteins actually dissolve a little bit when they're coming into contact with this brine. And so that what happens is that it makes sure that as they cook, they don't contract quite as much. And so as your meat is cooking, it doesn't contract as much, and therefore it stays juicier and more tender. It's something that I do with almost all my meats. Dry brining. The other thing is that you want to keep it uncovered while in the fridge, while it's resting like this. The idea is that as it's uncovered, first of all, you're going to limit bacterial decay by keeping it covered, because the surface is going to dry out, and dry surfaces are less hospitable to bacteria, as opposed to trapping the moisture right against the skin with, say, like a piece of plastic or something like that. The other thing is that as that surface dries out, it is actually going to sear a little better later on, so we're going to be able to get a better, darker crust and better texture and better flavor on this later on when we cook it. Anyhow, so I've salted it. I'm going to go back in the fridge, and it's going to stay in here for about 3 days, I'd say. A minimum of 2 days, up to 3. I'm going to try and get it in without getting any meat juices on the rest of the fridge. All right, so there we are. And I will be back in a few days later. So here is that steak pulled out of the fridge. So it doesn't look pretty, right? But trust me, that's what you're looking for. That sort of desiccated exterior, that little dry layer on the outside, that's what's going to give you a really, really nice crust as this cooks. I'm going to do this in my pizza oven. I have this big cast iron pan preheating over the highest heat, because I want the pan to be really nice and hot when the steak goes in. But then I'm going to drop it down to let the steak cook kind of nice and low and slow. The reason I wouldn't grill this is because with this much fat, when you try and grill with this much fat, it drips onto the fire, and it creates this big sooty infernal mess that you can't really deal with. So I would always recommend cooking a really fatty steak like this on a flat top or in a skillet, something that is going to sort of let it cook in its own fat, and that is not going to allow that fat to sort of ignite on fire. All right, so I have the flame going pretty high. I'm going to drop it down to quite low. This steak, I don't need to salt it anymore because it's already been salted. We'll salt it, when we slice it before we eat it, but the exterior, we don't need to do anything. So I'm just going to pick this up. I'm not going to put any fat in here because the steak's going to release plenty of its own fat. Just going to put it right in like that and let it start going nice and low and slow. Not really much to it. I'm going to be sort of monitoring it and flipping it every now and then. In fact, you know what? I'm going to go get something. Hold on a second. I'll be right back. All right, I'm back with my thermometer. This is my Combustion Inc. Thermometer. This is Chris Young's company. Chris Young is one of the original Chef Steps guys. He also worked at, the Fat Duck, and now makes cool hardware like this. Well, specifically this thermometer. What's cool about this thermometer is it has a bunch of sensors down its length. It doesn't just have one sensor in the tip the way a traditional thermometer would. A bunch of sensors up and down its tip, which means that what it does is it has this algorithm where it can tell the true core temperatures. So right now we're at 49 degrees. I'm looking to bring this to probably I'll bring it to around 120 or so, very, very low and slow, and then I'll check on the crust development, and I might pump up the heat for the last couple minutes to get a nicer crust, but I'm looking for a final post-resting temperature of probably around 127 degrees or so. So I'll bring it up to 120 and see where we're at. In fact, I'll bring it up to 115 and see where we're at. With fattier meats like this, with a very lean cut, say something like tenderloin with not a lot of fat on it, I would go slightly lower temperature. So maybe aim for a finished temperature of 120 degrees or so, which is where the meat is just starting to sort of firm up from cooking, but not so much that it's drying out. For a fattier cut, something like a ribeye, and particularly something very fatty like a Wagyu ribeye like this, I tend to go hotter, so 127, maybe even up to 130. Some people even like to go up to medium territory, like 135. The idea is that you want to get it at least hot enough that the fat renders and begins to soften so that it sort of coats your mouth instead of feeling, waxy. Yeah, I'll be back in probably a few minutes just to check on the steak and see how it's going, and we'll do a little flipping, and I will see you in a few minutes later. So I just want to take a peek at how we're doing. Oh, you'll notice the other nice thing about the thermometer is you can leave it in, it's safe up to like 500 degrees, something like that. All right. Ooh, look at that. We are getting some really nice crisping up there. Let's see what the crust on that first side looks like. Boy, would you take a look at that? That is a good looking crust, eh? All right. It's going to get even better as time goes on. So I flip it over. I'm going to let this just keep going. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it actually as far away from the fire now as possible. Let it get real nice, low and slow. No, I will be back in. All right, it's probably been, I don't know, half an hour or so, but you see my alarm went off. We hit 117 now in the very center. All I've done is I've flipped it a couple times here and there. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to pump up the jam. Pump up the jam. By jam, I mean this dial on the side that turns on the heat in the pizza oven. I'm also going to grab my thermometer out of there at this point. All right, so I got big heat going on. I'm gonna get a little searing action. I'm gonna take some thyme and some garlic and throw it in there. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give it a little bit of a baste. This kind of baste, What do we look like in there? Good, huh? Yeah. We're singeing some time. Singeing some time. Good. Yeah, so you can see why I don't want to grill this kind of steak, because all of this fat would end up going down into the fire, and that would sort of destroy, really destroy the steak. It just all turns sooty and gross. All right, so that fat is getting infused with the flavor of the garlic and the thyme. We're gonna spoon that on top of the steak as it cooks, and then I will finish this off with some delicious sides. Let's get that final temp in, huh? There we go, 125. Spot on. So by the time it's done resting, I think we'll be at around 130 or so. Pull you out over to the cutting board to rest. Look at there. Looky there. Alright, and then while that finishes, I'm just going to finish up some, got this broccoli. I always feel like if you got a hot oven, you should use it. So I'm going to roast this broccoli. Alright, so now what we're doing is we're resting the steak. Oh, so the broccoli was just cut up, olive oil, salt and pepper. Not much else. We're resting the steak. The idea here is that when the steak is still really, you know, sort of piping hot from the oven, well, from the grill or wherever it is you're cooking it, there, you know, there's some people who say, you know, people like Adam Perry Lang, a guy who I respect very much, who say, oh, eat the steak while it's piping hot. You know, you want that crust to be sort of sizzling and everything, and you know, that's one way to look at it. You know, other people will say it's better to let the steak rest, because what happens is those juices that are really hot, if you cut open the steak right now, they kind of gush out, and so as you eat them, like, you get that real big gush of juice at the beginning, but then the steak ends up a little bit drier. And so by letting the steak cool down a little bit, letting sort of the muscle fibers relax, and really letting the juices sort of thicken up a little bit again, by cooling, you actually end up with a more sort of succulent, tasty piece of meat. So I actually do like letting my meat rest. Oh, so this is sort of what I call a cheaty sauce bordelaise. A classic sauce bordelaise is basically a fortified red wine reduction. You sort of a flavored red wine reduction that you then add to a reduced roasted veal stock mixture. That's essentially like a brown sauce with a sauce espagnole with a wine reduction. I do sort of a cheaty version of it at home, because first of all, like, nobody at home is going to have, oh, look at this, I've already got fat all over my brand new patio. But what is a patio for if not for using? So instead of, nobody has veal stock at home. I never make veal stock at home, but I do roast a lot of chickens, or I do buy rotisserie chickens, and you can always make stock out of that. And so make chicken stock, reduce that chicken stock down nice, low and slow. I have a video on how to make like a rich chicken jus. So do that a couple times with a few batches of chickens, and add all the batches of jus together, and reduce them down, and you'll get something that is, not exactly like a brown veal stock, but you'll get something that has a really nice sort of rich, meaty, sort of demi-glace texture and flavor to it, which is really what we're after. And that's an excellent sauce for that. Oh, to that I just added some red wine and reduced it down. Also some thyme sprigs, a bunch of sort of aromatic things. Whatever you find tastes good, you can stick in there. Let it reduce all down and then strain it. Go. And that thickness, that thickness you see here, that's all just from that viscosity, that richness, that's all just from the gelatin from chicken, reduced chicken stock. Doesn't work with store-bought stock. It has to be homemade stuff. So you have to get your own chickens and simmer them into stock for it to work, because store-bought stock does not have enough gelatin in it. All right. This meat is looking pretty good, huh? All right, so you can see even when it's done, there's still that the spinalis, right? Like I can almost cut it on the seam there. You see? That's the spinalis I'm cutting off there. And this here is the actual part, the longissimus. All right, right, let's see how our broccoli is doing. They're looking pretty delicious. I love the way sort of brassicas, you know, broccoli, cauliflower, things like that. Brussels sprouts. I'll take a little bit of this beef fat, steal a little bit of that flavor. How it gets sort of a nice nutty, sweet flavor when you roast it at high temperatures like this. I think that's almost done. All right, so I'm gonna finish slicing up this beef. We'll do a little tasting of sorts. So I've got some of this some of these spinalis here. Oh yeah. We'll let that rest, and you'll see what happens as it rests. Also, you'll get this sort of bloom of color. But you see how the fat is just starting to soften up here. That's sort of that ideal texture that you want for this really fatty beef. I'm gonna cut off a nice little slice of the longissimus. Oh. And then I'm gonna take my broccoli. Oh, hey, Wombat. Sorry. I love carrots cooked in sauce bordelaise. I don't know why, but they just come out super sort of sweet and succulent. All right, so I'm gonna take some of my bordelaise cooked carrots here. Get a little bit of our broccoli roasted in beef fat here. Keep it nice and simple. What we'll do is so I have these breadcrumbs. These are just panko that I roasted in a little bit of fried in a little bit of olive oil, and then added a bit of crushed garlic, fresh garlic, some anchovies, some parsley. All right, let's get a little bit of our beef in there, and I'll finish it off with some of these sauce. You know, I didn't really skim the sauce or strain it or anything, so you can see it has that kind of fat on there, something that, you know, if you went to a fancy French restaurant would be unacceptable. But I'm in my backyard. Not at a fancy French restaurant. Oh, look at this though. A little bit of salt. Oh my God. Holy cow. Dense and meaty and melts. All right. Oh my God. Oh boy. All right, everybody. Guys. Gals. Non-binary pals. This is good. All right, I will see you next time. Bye-bye.